This test takes only 10 seconds, but what it reveals about you can take a lifetime to fully understand. Carl Jung believed that the unconscious speaks first, before logic, before fear, before explanations have time to form. And when it does, it doesn't use words, it uses symbols. In a moment, you'll be shown a small set of symbols. Your task is simple. Don't analyze them. Don't compare them. Don't try to guess what they mean. Just notice which one pulls your attention instantly. That reaction is not random. According to Jung, the unconscious mind is constantly active, shaping your emotions, decisions, and patterns, even when you're not aware of it. Most of the time, the conscious mind steps in too quickly, filtering everything through logic and habit. But instinctive choices slip through that filter. They reveal what is already moving beneath the surface. This is why this test works in just 10 seconds. Not because it's shallow, but because it's fast enough to bypass your defenses. Before we begin, it's important to understand one thing. There is no right or wrong choice here. This is not a test of intelligence, morality, or personality types. It's a reflection of your current inner state, a snapshot of where your emotional energy is right now. So take a breath, let your shoulders relax, and allow yourself to simply observe. In a moment, you will see several symbolic forms appear. When they do, resist the urge to think. The mind will want to interfere. It will try to justify, explain, and label. Gently step aside and let your first reaction rise on its own. Which symbol feels familiar? Which one feels strangely important? Which one seems to look back at you? You don't need to understand why. Understanding comes later. Right now, all that matters is noticing. Take the next 10 seconds. Pause, allow silence and visual focus. If you've made your choice, hold on to it. You don't need to say it out loud yet. Just keep it in mind as we move forward. What you chose is not a coincidence. Jung believed that the unconscious selects symbols that mirror unresolved questions, emotional needs, or stages of inner growth. Sometimes the symbol reflects a strength you're developing. Other times it points to a tension you've been avoiding. In the next chapters, we'll explore what each of these symbols represents, not as rigid labels, but as living patterns of the psyche. As you listen, pay attention not only to what resonates, but also to what makes you uncomfortable. Both reactions are meaningful, because this test didn't begin when the symbols appeared. It began the moment something inside you responded. If the symbol you chose represents stability, grounding, or calm endurance, this choice often appears during moments when the soul is seeking balance rather than excitement. This symbol is drawn to people who have been through emotional movement, sometimes chaos, sometimes loss, sometimes prolonged uncertainty, and are now unconsciously orienting themselves towards something steady. Not because life has become easy, but because the psyche is asking for firmness beneath the feet. In Jungian psychology, symbols of grounding are closely connected to the instinct for preservation. They emerge when the unconscious senses that growth will no longer come from acceleration, but from consolidation. This is the phase where depth matters more than speed. People who choose this symbol are often more resilient than they realize. They may appear calm to others, composed, even reserved, yet beneath that surface lies a quiet weight, experiences that required patience, emotional containment, and endurance. This choice does not mean emotional numbness. On the contrary, it often reflects someone who has learned to feel deeply without being overwhelmed. However, stability has its shadow. This symbol can also appear when a person has been carrying too much alone. When responsibility becomes habitual, rest can feel unfamiliar. There may be a tendency to stay grounded for others while quietly neglecting personal needs. Jung warned that when the psyche over-identifies with strength, vulnerability retreats into the unconscious, where it still seeks expression. If this symbol called to you, your unconscious may be asking a subtle question. Are you grounding yourself, or are you holding yourself together? There is an important difference. Grounding brings nourishment. Holding together brings tension. This stage of life often involves rebuilding trust, not necessarily in others, but in one's own inner rhythm. It is about learning that stillness is not stagnation, and that slowness does not mean regression. Many people who choose this symbol are in the middle of a healing process they rarely name out loud. Jung associated this phase with the strengthening of the ego-self relationship. The personality begins to align with deeper values rather than external expectations. Choices become quieter, but more intentional. There is less desire to prove and more desire to preserve what truly matters. If this interpretation resonates, it may be a sign that your psyche is preparing for long-term growth, not dramatic transformation, but rooted evolution, the kind that unfolds invisibly yet changes everything over time. As we move forward, remember this: stability is not the absence of movement, it is the presence of inner support, and not every soul is called to remain still. Some are being pulled toward intensity, instinct, and confrontation, which leads us to the next symbol. If the symbol that drew you in carries a sense of intensity, movement, or raw presence, this choice often emerges during periods of inner confrontation. It appears when something inside you is no longer willing to stay quiet. In Jungian psychology, instinct is not something primitive to be eliminated. It is something vital that demands recognition. When instinctive symbols rise to the surface, they usually signal that an essential part of the psyche has been restrained for too long. What was once adaptive is now becoming restrictive. People who choose this symbol are often navigating strong internal pressures. There may be unexpressed anger, ambition, desire, or a longing for autonomy that hasn't yet found a conscious outlet. This does not mean a lack of control. In fact, many individuals drawn to this symbol have exercised too much control for too long. Jung described the shadow as the collection of traits the conscious personality has pushed aside in order to function. Power, assertiveness, and instinctual confidence are frequently among those traits, especially in people who learned early that they needed to be agreeable, responsible, or emotionally contained. When this symbol appears, it often signals a turning point. The psyche is no longer asking for balance, it is asking for honesty. If this resonates, you may be standing at the edge of an internal boundary. There is something you know on a deep level that cannot be postponed much longer. A decision, a confrontation, or a shift in self-definition may already be forming beneath your awareness. However, intensity has its shadow as well. When instinct is ignored, it doesn't disappear. It hardens. It may turn into irritability, restlessness, or chronic tension. Some people mistake this energy for aggression, when in truth it is the psyche's attempt to restore integrity. Instinct wants alignment, not destruction. Jung believed that true strength emerges when instinct is integrated, not suppressed. When conscious awareness meets raw inner force, energy becomes direction rather than chaos. The goal is not to act impulsively, but to act truthfully. If this symbol called to you, ask yourself gently, where am I holding back a necessary expression of myself, and what am I afraid might happen if I stop holding it back? This stage of life often involves reclaiming boundaries, saying no without justification, wanting without apology, recognizing that power, when acknowledged consciously, does not have to be harmful. As this energy begins to find form, the psyche naturally moves toward greater complexity. Instinct opens the door, but what lies beyond it requires adaptability, intuition, and inner nuance. And that brings us to the next symbol. If the symbol that drew your attention feels complex, layered, or subtly intelligent, this choice often reflects a psyche that operates beyond simple categories. It appears in individuals who sense that life cannot be reduced to clear answers or single identities. In Jungian psychology, complexity is not confusion, it is depth. People drawn to this symbol tend to perceive multiple emotional currents at once. They can hold opposing feelings, see different perspectives, and intuit what lies beneath the surface of situations. This intuitive sensitivity often develops early as a response to environments that required emotional awareness in order to feel safe or connected. If this symbol resonated with you, it may indicate that your inner world is highly active. Thoughts, feelings, and impressions flow continuously, sometimes overlapping. You may sense that you are always adapting, shifting tone, energy, or behavior depending on context. This adaptability is a strength, but it also carries a hidden cost. Jung observed that when a person becomes too skilled at adaptation, the core self can begin to blur. The unconscious then sends symbols of complexity to signal a need for reintegration, a reminder that flexibility should not come at the expense of authenticity. This symbol often appears during periods of identity transition. You may be questioning old roles, re-evaluating long-held beliefs, or sensing that the person you once were no longer fully represents who you are becoming. There can be a quiet discomfort in this stage, not because something is wrong, but because something is unfinished. The shadow of this symbol lies in overextension. When intuition is constantly active, rest can feel elusive. There may be a tendency to overthink, to absorb others' emotions, or to feel responsible for maintaining harmony. Jung warned that intuitive types can become trapped in their own inner complexity, mistaking mental activity for emotional clarity. If this interpretation resonates, your unconscious may be asking for simplification, not of thought, but of alignment. Which parts of yourself are essential? Which adaptations no longer serve you? This stage of life invites discernment. It is about choosing when to engage and when to withdraw, when to listen deeply, and when to protect inner space. Complexity becomes wisdom only when it is grounded in self-recognition. Jung believed that intuition is a bridge between the conscious and unconscious worlds. When honored, it becomes guidance rather than noise. When ignored, it turns inward, creating tension and fatigue. If this symbol called to you, it may be time to ask, what part of myself is asking to be recognized, not managed? As intuition begins to settle into clarity, the psyche naturally turns toward connection, toward meaning found not only within, but between selves. And that leads us to the next symbol. If the symbol that called to you carries a sense of connection, warmth, or emotional resonance, this choice often reflects a psyche oriented toward meaning through relationship. It appears in people whose inner world is shaped not only by thought, but by feeling, by bonds, memories, and shared emotional space. In Jungian psychology, the self does not form in isolation. It emerges through relationship, first with caregivers, later with friends, partners, communities, and symbolic figures that carry emotional weight. When symbols of connection arise, they often indicate a deep sensitivity to emotional currents, both one's own and those of others. People drawn to this symbol tend to feel deeply and intuitively. They notice emotional shifts in a room, sense unspoken tensions, and often understand others without words. This capacity for emotional attunement is a gift, but it is also a responsibility the psyche does not take lightly. Jung observed that individuals with strong relational orientation often struggle with boundaries. Because connection feels natural, separation can feel threatening. There may be a tendency to give more than is sustainable, to remain emotionally available even when depleted, or to confuse empathy with obligation. If this symbol resonated with you, your unconscious may be reflecting a central question. Where do I connect out of love? And where do I connect out of fear of disconnection? This stage of life often arises when a person is reassessing emotional investments. You may be questioning which relationships nourish you and which quietly drain you. There can be grief in this realization, especially when bonds formed in the past no longer align with who you are becoming. The shadow of this symbol lies in self-abandonment. When meaning is sought exclusively through others, the inner voice can fade into the background. Jung warned that over-identification with emotional roles, caretaker, supporter, mediator, can lead to a loss of inner center. The unconscious then sends symbols of connection, not to demand more giving but to restore balance. True connection, Jung believed, does not require self-erasure. It requires presence, the ability to remain emotionally open while still rooted in one's own inner truth. If this interpretation feels familiar, your psyche may be inviting you to redefine closeness, to explore relationships that allow mutual recognition rather than silent sacrifice, to understand that emotional depth flourishes where honesty is permitted. This stage is not about withdrawing from others, nor about clinging to them. It is about choosing connection consciously, with awareness of limits, needs, and inner values. As emotional meaning finds healthier expression, the psyche begins to integrate the insights revealed by all the symbols together. What once appeared fragmented starts to form a coherent inner narrative. And that brings us to the final stage of this journey. Each symbol you encountered in this test reflects a different movement of the psyche, but none of them define who you are in absolute terms. In Jungian psychology, symbols do not assign identities, they illuminate processes. What you chose reveals not your personality, but your current life chapter. Jung believed that individuation is not a straight path, it unfolds in cycles. At different moments, the psyche calls for grounding, intensity, complexity, or connection, depending on what is needed for balance and growth. The unconscious selects symbols that mirror this need long before the conscious mind understands it. If your symbol pointed towards stability, it may reflect a phase of consolidation, a time when your inner world is asking for rest, structure, and rootedness after movement or uncertainty. If intensity and instinct called to you, the psyche may be preparing you for assertion, a reclaiming of power, boundaries, or suppressed desires that can no longer remain hidden. If complexity and intuition resonated, you may be navigating a transition of identity, letting go of old roles, integrating multiple inner voices, and learning which aspects of yourself deserve space and which no longer do. If connection and emotional meaning drew your attention, your unconscious may be recalibrating how you relate to others, seeking relationships that reflect who you are now, not who you had to be before. None of these stages are better than the others. Each one represents a necessary movement toward wholeness. Jung emphasized that psychological growth does not mean eliminating contradictions. It means learning to hold them consciously. This is why your reaction mattered more than your reasoning. The unconscious does not shout. It whispers, and it speaks through symbols. If something in this test resonated deeply, sit with it, not to analyze it immediately, but to notice how it echoes through your thoughts, emotions, and daily choices. Awareness is not an answer. It is the beginning of transformation. If you feel comfortable, share in the comments which symbol you chose. Not to explain yourself, but to acknowledge the moment of recognition. Often, naming a symbol gives it a place in consciousness, where it can no longer operate unseen. If you found this reflection meaningful, consider subscribing. These tests are not about prediction or judgment, but about listening more closely to the inner world that shapes your outer life. There will be other symbols, other choices, other moments of recognition, and each time the unconscious will be waiting, not to control you, but to guide you toward a deeper understanding of yourself.